What would you do if you were 19 years old, orphaned twice over by circumstance, and left standing on a train platform with $7 sewn into the hem of your only good dress? That was Odessa Vane's arithmetic in the autumn of 1891, after the county bank, under the cold signature of a man named Silas Corbett, foreclosed on the last acre her father had ever plowed. Corbett had smiled while he did it, the way men do when they have already decided a thing is theirs. With her $7, her mother's sewing shears, and a resolve she did not yet trust, Odessa boarded a westbound freight car bound for nowhere in particular, and stepped off 3 days later in an auction yard where the county was selling off a ruined settlement nobody wanted, a place called Millhaven Crossing, swallowed whole by a flood 4 years before, its depot and its debts both drowned in silt. She bought the entire town site, deed and all, for $5, and the men around her laughed at the foolishness of a girl buying a graveyard of mud. They did not know that beneath that silt, sealed in a vault no flood had ever managed to open, something was waiting that would not only change the course of her life, but call home every soul that town had ever lost. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Vane. If you're watching this from a place the world has written off as finished, we'd love to hear about it in the comments, and if stories like this one speak to you, we'd be grateful if you'd follow or subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. Odessa had been raised on a farm 11 miles outside of a Kansas town called Prather's Mill, in a clapboard house her father built with his own hands the same year he married her mother. Her father, Thomas Vane, was not a wealthy man by any measure that showed up in a ledger, but he was wealthy in the way that mattered on the prairie. He could fix anything that broke, coax anything that grew, and he never once, in all the years Odessa knew him, spoke an unkind word he didn't later apologize for. Her mother, Ruth, had come from a family of seamstresses in St. Louis, and she taught Odessa to sew before she taught her to read, on the theory that a woman who could mend a coat could always find work, but a woman who could only read books might find herself hungry in a library. It was practical wisdom, delivered with a laugh, but it shaped something in Odessa that would matter more than either of her parents could have guessed. An instinct for finding the worth hidden inside a thing that looked, to everyone else, like it was past saving. She used to take torn dresses that other farm wives had given up on and turn them into something a person would be proud to wear to church. She mended fence posts that the neighboring men swore were fit only for firewood. She had, even as a girl of 12 and 13, a particular patience for ruin, a willingness to sit with something broken long enough to understand why it broke and what it might still be good for. Her father used to tell her that value wasn't a fixed thing, that it moved depending on who was looking and what they were willing to see. He'd point at a rusted plow blade someone had left to the weather and say, "Most men see scrap, but if you clean it right and set the edge, it's still a plow." He said the same about people, sometimes, when he thought she wasn't listening closely, about the widow 2 farms over that the town gossiped about the drifter he'd hired for harvest one year, who turned out to be the hardest worker he'd ever employed. Odessa absorbed this the way children absorb the things said to them sideways, without ceremony, and it became something closer to a creed than a lesson, that the world was full of things and people that had simply been misjudged, and that patience, more than money, was the tool that revealed what they were really worth. She did not know, at 17, that this creed would one day be the only inheritance she had left, or that it would lead her, 2 years later, to purchase an entire drowned town for less than the price of a good pair of boots. Her mother died of a fever in the winter Odessa turned 16, and something in her father seemed to go under the ice with her, even though his body kept working the land for 2 more years. He grew quieter. He let small debts accumulate that he would once have paid off within the season, telling Odessa not to worry, that a man was allowed a little slack when grief had its hand on his collar. She believed him, because she wanted to, and because at 16 and 17 a daughter is not always given the whole ledger of her father's troubles. What she did not know, what she would only learn later, reading through papers in a lawyer's office with her father 8 months in the ground, was that Thomas Vane had, in his last year, borrowed against the farm to cover her mother's medical bills and the burial after, and that the note had been quietly bought up from the original lender by a man named Silas Corbett, who ran the largest bank in 3 counties, and who had, it was rumored though never proven, a habit of acquiring the debts of grieving men, because grieving men rarely read the fine print. The fall, when it came almost gently, which was its own kind of cruelty. There was no dramatic showdown, no dark night of violence, only a series of small procedural humiliations. A letter arrived. Then a man arrived, polite and apologetic, with papers for her father to sign, papers her father, worn thin by 2 years of quiet mourning, signed without argument because he no longer had the strength left to argue. Thomas Vane died that same winter, some said of the flu that swept through the county, though Odessa privately believed he died of the particular exhaustion that comes from watching everything you built get itemized and repossessed by a man who never once raised his voice. She buried her father beside her mother on a gray February morning with 4 neighbors in attendance, and by April, Silas Corbett's bank held the deed to the only home she had ever known, and a foreman was already surveying her father's fields for a buyer who wanted the water rights more than the soil. She was given 11 days to remove her belongings. She took her mother's shears, her father's good pocket knife, a Bible with both their names written inside the cover, 2 dresses, and the $7 that remained after she'd sold what furniture the bank didn't already claim as collateral. She did not cry in front of Corbett when she came to return the house key. Though she wanted to, badly, she only looked at him, at his clean fingernails and his patient, practiced sympathy, and said that she hoped he slept well at night, and he told her, without a trace of shame, that a bank could not run on sentiment, and that he wished her the very best. She walked out of that office at 18 years old, with no home, no family, and no plan beyond the vague and stubborn conviction, inherited from her father, that somewhere there was a thing everyone else had given up on that she could still make into something. She drifted for the better part of a year, taking in mending work in towns along the rail line, sleeping in boarding houses when she could afford them, and church halls when she could not, watching her $7 dwindle, and then, through relentless economy, slowly grow back toward 9. It was in a town called Larrabee, in the autumn of 1891, that she heard 2 men at a feed store talking about a county auction happening the following week. The county, it seemed, was finally clearing its books of a worthless parcel it had carried since a flood 4 years prior. A dead railroad town nobody had lived in since the water came through, and nobody expected the auction to draw more than a curiosity bid or 2. One of the men laughed and said the county would probably have to pay someone to take it. Odessa, sewing a shirt collar at a table near the window, said nothing, but something in her went very still and very alert, the way it always did when she heard someone describe a ruin with contempt. The town, they said, had been called Millhaven Crossing, built up around a rail depot in the boom years of the late 70s, when a spur line was expected to connect it to the larger trunk route running east. It had grown fast, the way railroad towns did: a depot, a bank, a general store, a schoolhouse, 40 or 50 families drawn by the promise of the rails. Then, in the spring of 1887, the earthen dam upriver that had been built to manage spring runoff gave way in a single night, after a season of unusually heavy rain, and the water came down through the valley and buried Millhaven Crossing under 6 feet of silt and river mud before dawn. Some said it was simple bad luck, an act of God the town could not have prevented. Others, in the quieter tones people use for things they cannot prove, said the dam had been neglected on purpose, that repairs had been requested and refused, that someone with money to gain from the town's failure had let the water come. No one had ever pressed the matter, because by the time the mud dried, there was no town left worth fighting over, and the survivors scattered to whatever kin or work they could find. The rail spur was never built. The county had held the deed ever since, an asset on paper only, worth nothing but the taxes it cost to keep listed. Odessa arrived at the auction with what remained of her money, expecting only to watch. The auctioneer, a tired man with a ledger he clearly wished to close, opened the bidding on the Millhaven Crossing parcel, 340 acres, full town site, mineral and water rights included, structures as they stand, at a token opening price, meant more to satisfy procedure than to attract real interest. 2 men bid half-heartedly against each other up to $4, more out of boredom than intent, and then stopped, and the auctioneer was already lifting his gavel to call it unsold when Odessa heard her own voice say $5, clear and steady, before she had entirely decided to say it. There was a ripple of laughter, not unkind exactly, but the laughter men give to something they find sweetly absurd. A girl with a sewing bag buying a drowned graveyard of a town. The auctioneer, perhaps eager to be rid of the parcel at last, brought the gavel down before anyone could think better of it, and just like that, at 19 years old, Odessa Vane owned a town. She rode out to Millhaven Crossing 3 days later in the back of a grain wagon whose driver, an older farmer named Ansel Pruitt, told her flatly that she'd wasted her money and that the mud out there would swallow a person's boots whole. He was not wrong about the mud. What had once been a main street was now a shallow gray basin, cracked in a lattice of dried silt where the summer sun had baked the last of the standing water away. And rising up out of that basin, half buried and leaning at strange angles, were the bones of the town, the skeletal frame of the depot, roofless and gray, the brick shell of what had been a bank, a scatter of collapsed roofs that had once been homes, all of it wearing 4 years of silence like a shroud. Odessa stood at the edge of it, with her small bundle of belongings, and felt, instead of despair, something closer to recognition, the same feeling she used to get looking at a torn dress before she'd found the seam that would let her remake it into something new. She began, in the weeks that followed, the only way she knew how to begin anything, by clearing what could be cleared and looking closely at what remained. She built herself a rough shelter from salvaged depot lumber, dug a fresh well by the old schoolhouse where the water table ran clean, and spent her days shoveling silt away from doorways and foundations, partly out of necessity and partly, she admitted to herself, out of the same stubborn curiosity that had always drawn her toward broken things. It was in her 3rd week, clearing mud from the collapsed threshold of what had been the town's small bank building, that her shovel struck something that did not give the way silt gives, a hard, flat surface, iron by the sound of it, buried just beneath the floor where the vault should have stood. She dug through the afternoon and into the dusk with her hands raw and her breath short, and by the time the light failed her, she had uncovered the corner of an iron door, sealed shut, rusted at the hinges but intact, set into what remained of a stone foundation that the flood had buried but never breached. She could not open it that night, nor the next, and it took the better part of 2 weeks, with a borrowed pry bar from Ansel Pruitt, who had begun, despite himself, checking in on her progress with a curiosity he wouldn't quite name as concern, before the door gave way with a groan that seemed to come up out of the earth itself. Inside, dry as the day it was sealed, protected from 4 years of flood and silt by stone and iron both, was a small vault no larger than a pantry. And within it, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp entirely at bay, Odessa found a strongbox, a leather ledger, and a single sealed letter, its wax still unbroken, addressed in a careful, deliberate hand to whoever still believes in Millhaven Crossing. She sat on the floor of that ruined bank with the letter in her lap for a long while before she opened it, feeling the particular weight of a message meant for a stranger it could not have known would come. When she finally broke the seal, she found it was written by a man named Ezra Millhaven, the town's founder, dated the night before the flood came through. A night, it turned out, he had already suspected might be his town's last. He wrote that he had received, 3 days prior, a private warning from a foreman on the dam crew. A man who told him the repairs the county had approved and paid for had never actually been made, that the funds for those repairs had instead been diverted, and that the dam was likely to fail with the next heavy rain. Ezra wrote that he had gone immediately to the man he believed responsible for redirecting those funds, a young, ambitious banker from a neighboring county who had been quietly buying up land options along the proposed rail spur route, land that would be worth a fortune if the town failed and the survivors sold cheap, and worth nothing at all if the town thrived and held its ground. That banker's name, written plainly in Ezra Millhaven's steady hand, was Silas Corbett. Odessa read that name 3 times before she trusted her own eyes. The ledger, when she opened it with trembling hands, confirmed what the letter alleged in painstaking, methodical detail: receipts, correspondence, and a record of the dam repair funds that had been authorized by the county, drawn down by Corbett's early banking concern under a contractor's name that did not, according to Ezra's own careful cross-referencing, correspond to any registered contractor in the territory. Ezra had gathered this evidence in the frantic days before the flood, intending to bring it before the county commissioners. But the water came before he could act, and in the chaos of that single terrible night, with families to save and no time left for justice, he had done the only thing left within his power. He had sealed the evidence, along with the town's cooperative rebuilding fund, a strong box of savings the townsfolk had pooled together over years for exactly this kind of disaster, into the one vault built strong enough to survive what was coming, in the hope that someday someone honest would find it and finish what he could not. The strongbox held nearly $4,000 in gold and silver coin, untouched by water or time, and the weight of it in Odessa's hands felt less like wealth and more like a debt passed down to her from a man she had never met, a debt owed not to her but to every family who had once called Millhaven Crossing home and never been made whole for what they lost. She thought of her own father, signing away his farm without the strength left to fight a man who never raised his voice, and she understood, with a clarity that settled into her bones, that Silas Corbett had done this before, had likely done it many times, quietly, patiently, to anyone whose grief or misfortune made them too tired to read the fine print, and that this time, for the first time, someone had left behind the proof. She did not act rashly. She spent the following weeks quietly, carefully, tracing what had become of Millhaven Crossing's scattered families through letters and inquiries sent along the rail lines, using a portion of the coin to fund the search, writing to postmasters and county clerks in a dozen towns to ask after names listed in Ezra's ledger. Slowly, cautiously, replies began to come back, a blacksmith's widow now working as a laundress 2 counties over, a schoolteacher who had never taught again after the flood took her schoolhouse and her nerve both, a family of 5 who'd been split apart, the children sent to different relatives who could each afford to take only one. Odessa wrote to each of them the same careful message, that the town they had lost still held something owed to them, and that she meant, with their help, to see it paid. Word of what she was doing did not stay quiet for long, and it was inevitable that it reached Silas Corbett, whose bank had, in the intervening years, grown into the most powerful financial concern in 3 counties, exactly as his old scheme had intended it to. He came to Millhaven Crossing himself in the spring, arriving in a hired carriage with 2 clerks and an air of a man performing a kindness he did not feel, offering to buy the town site from Odessa outright at a price 4 times what she'd paid, framing it as generosity toward a young woman who had, in his telling, gotten in over her head with a foolish and sentimental purchase. She recognized him at once, of course, though 4 years and the change in his fortunes had rounded his face and grayed his temples, and she watched him look at her without recognition at all. A girl he had once evicted from a farmhouse now standing in the mud of a town he had once flooded. And she understood in that moment that men like Corbett did not remember the people they'd wronged, because remembering would have required admitting there had been a wrong at all. She declined his offer, politely, and told him she intended to rebuild. Corbett's manner shifted, the way it always did, she suspected, when patience failed to produce the result he wanted. He reminded her that the county still held certain rights over unclaimed infrastructure, that a rail spur project he was quietly financing might soon require exactly the land she was standing on, and that a girl alone, with no family and no standing, would find it difficult to hold ground against interests larger than her own. It was a threat wearing the clothes of a caution. And Odessa, who had spent a lifetime learning to see the worth hidden inside things other people dismissed, understood that Corbett was, in his own way, dismissing her the same way he'd once dismissed a flooded town, as an asset too small to matter, too weak to resist. She said nothing of the ledger, only thanked him for his concern and told him she would consider his words carefully, and watched him ride away satisfied that he had frightened a foolish girl back into sense. He did not know that within a fortnight, 7 of Millhaven Crossing's original families had begun making their way back toward the valley, drawn by Odessa's letters and by a hope they had long since stopped allowing themselves to feel. And he did not know that the returning schoolteacher, a woman named Clara Whitfield, who had taught in the old schoolhouse and remembered Ezra Millhaven as a friend, had brought with her a cousin who now clerked for the Territorial Land Office and understood exactly how to make evidence of fraud impossible to bury a second time. Together, over the weeks that followed, Odessa and the returning families rebuilt what they could of the town by hand, using a portion of the recovered fund for lumber and tools, while Clara and her cousin prepared Ezra Millhaven's ledger, letters, and receipts into a formal complaint, corroborated now by the testimony of townsfolk who remembered, once prompted, the strange coincidences of contractors never seen and repairs never made. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not happen with raised voices or drawn weapons, but in the plain daylight of a territorial hearing room, where Silas Corbett arrived expecting to answer a minor procedural inquiry about a rail spur filing, and found instead a room containing the ledger he had believed drowned forever. The sworn statements of families he had once counted on to disappear quietly, and a young woman standing at the back of the room he did not, even then, fully recognize. The evidence was methodical, unglamorous, and utterly damning, laid out with the same patient thoroughness Odessa had once used to find the seam in a ruined dress. And though the law of that place and time could not undo 4 years, or restore a dam, or give back the families their scattered years, it could and did strip Corbett of his banking charter, force restitution to the county, and to Millhaven Crossing's rebuilding effort, and leave him, for the first time in his long career of quiet advantage, publicly and permanently known for exactly what he was. He did not go to prison. He did not need to. It was enough, in a country where a man's word and credit were his whole fortune, that his name could no longer be trusted anywhere the story traveled, and the story traveled fast and far, carried by newspapers hungry for a tale of a flooded town's revenge. By the following spring, Millhaven Crossing had its depot rebuilt, its schoolhouse reopened under Clara Whitfield's steady hand, and nearly 30 of its original families resettled on land Odessa had. With the last of Ezra's recovered fund and the trust of the families themselves, formally organized into a cooperative township deed, so that no single person, including herself, could ever again hold the whole of it in a way that made it vulnerable to a single man's ambition. She kept for herself only the old bank building, which she turned, fittingly, into a dressmaker's shop and a mending house, where she took in torn coats and broken chairs and any other thing a person had given up on, and made them useful again. What would you do, we asked you at the start of this story, if you were 19 and had nothing left but $7 and a stubborn belief that ruined things still held their worth? Odessa Vane did not know, standing in the mud of a drowned town with men laughing behind her, that she was about to become the instrument of a promise sealed 4 years earlier by a man who never lived to see it kept. She only knew what her father had taught her, without ever quite meaning to teach it, that value does not vanish just because the world stops looking for it, and that patience, more often than money, is what finally sets a thing right. Millhaven Crossing did not rise again because of gold in a vault. It rose because a girl who had been discarded once refused to let a town be discarded twice, and in restoring it, she restored, quietly and without any fanfare she ever sought, her own name and her own place in the world. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Odessa's story tonight. If a tale of overlooked worth and quiet justice moved something in you, we would love for you to share it with someone who might need to hear it too. And if you haven't already, please consider following or subscribing to our channel so you never miss the next story we tell. Before you go, we'll leave you with the same question this story left us with. What is a time you found real value in something the world around you had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.